Hey, before I get started, I want to give a shout out to arcadeshop.com. I order a lot of stuff from these guys. This is not an official endorsement or they haven't endorsed my program or anything. I just think they're great, very fast, always seem to have what I need. Support them, support small businesses at this time, especially as our hobby grows. Hey, welcome back to the Quarantine Chronicles here in the workshop. My name is Cassandra. I'm the vintage arcade gal, and we're using this time of social distancing with the coronavirus to attempt to get some of these lingering projects done here in the workshop, and there are a lot of them. So we've made some pretty good progress this week, so we're going to take a look at the major projects. We've made progress on 3 of them. In fact, one is pretty much almost done, so we'll take a look at that. And then there's a side project I hadn't talked about in any of the other videos we'll take a look at that we finished. And I got a really rare PCB board from an arcade game that's upstairs in one of the cabinets right now. We'll take a look at. I've been looking for this for a while. It's a pretty interesting and very rare game, and it's not a game people really ever talk about very much. So let's take a look at the major projects first, and we'll see the progress of them, and then we'll take it from there. Big news is going to be the Arkanoid game. The Arkanoid game is, well, it's completely finished other than the artwork. I'm waiting for the artwork. Like a lot of things, the coronavirus situation has kind of gummed up the works as far as production. I redid the control panel, had to get all the dents out. Also did the coin box. It looks pretty good. It was in pretty bad shape. Normally people would probably powder coat these things, but it's so dented and so pitted, just didn't bother. I did put a nice new decal on it though. Here you can see putting some primer, fixing the cabinet up the best I can, and then voila, we have a totally working game. It's looking great. It's just kind of naked, and once we get the artwork, we'll be able to put the artwork and the new bezel on there. You can see that's just the Miss Pac-Man one reversed. We took a beat up old Miss Pac-Man game that would have been trash for most people, and through the process of it, we've turned it into something. So I'm really excited to have this in the arcade. Just got to get that side art ready to go. So here we have our long-suffering Simpsons cabinet, which I have taken off the front panel, and you can see it's just heavily damaged, terrible condition, and we'll have to make a new one of these. It was bolted on with a wing and a prayer and a lot of supports. Somebody at some point got very angry at this game and took it off. I have the wood on order to fix both the sides and make a new front for this game. Just hasn't arrived yet. Again, it's because of what's going on in the country, but we should get it next week, and then hopefully we'll be able to use our biscuit joiner. But there's one other thing with this cabinet that has been completed, so let's take a look at that. The big news with the Simpsons cabinet is the control panel is completely finished. It's been totally restored from top to bottom. We have our new overlay and our new Wicco sticks on this. New old stock Wiccos, which can be hard to find in the right colors. And it looks great. The actual box beneath the control panel had seen a lot of abuse, so there's a lot of putty, and then while I was doing this, I dropped it and I had to fix it yet again. Just gotta be careful, I guess. I'm a little bit of a klutz, so I had to watch that sometimes. But anyway, I'm very, very excited. This looks great. Nothing's wired up yet. It's but all the joysticks and buttons and leaf switches are in there like they should be. But progress, right? Now we just need to finish the rest of the cabinet. Okay, we have one more major project to look at, and that's our Jungle King cocktail. So let's take a look at that real quick. So some progress on our very long-suffering Jungle King cocktail project. Still working fine. What I've done is I have started rebuilding the control panels, which have an extra button on them. So I'm going to need to filled that extra button, and we've sanded and painted this one, as you can see. We have the new overlays for it, and we've rebuilt the joysticks, and we have new leaf switch buttons as well. The other thing, of course, the biggest holdup with this game has been this top glass, because I have been searching for about a year for the original artwork of the top glass, and nobody had it, nobody had scanned it, and there are no reproductions available. But I created a new one, and the decal, the under decal, or underlay as some people would call, is on the way. Ironically, while this is going on, I had a collector reach out to me and actually found a cocktail that had been converted into a trivia game, but had the original Tato top glass intact, and that is on the way from Florida. So we will actually have a choice between the original and my creation, and we'll get them side by side and decide which one is best. But the greatest outcome of this is, because the original top glass is on the way, I'll be able to scan it and then make that artwork available to anyone who needs it. Other than that, no real progress on the Space Harrier, other than I fixed one of the sound pots. Not a big deal. No momentum on the Donkey Kong, although it's totally working. But we might make some momentum on our paint booth next week or the week after. And no news on our Cloak and Dagger or Stargate project, but that is the project that is on the bottom of the barrel. I don't see any progress happening with that project until maybe the end of summer. So anyway, those are our projects. So let's take a look at something a little different. I tend to keep these videos pretty centric towards arcade games and don't really veer into collecting like home video game systems or other things, but I'm a big fan of personal computers from the early 80s. I grew up in the 80s and the 70s, and my dad was an electronic engineer, and we had home computers in our house starting in the late 70s, starting with Tandy products, and even we had a Commodore PET. We even had teletype in our garage at some point. In the mid-80s, our house was kind of inundated with IBM PC clones, which sucked for video games at that point. So I saved my money and I bought myself an Atari 520 ST, which is a common computer in Europe, but the ST didn't go over very well here in the United States. It has kind of a cult following of like musicians, but otherwise it didn't really go anywhere. But Europe was huge, along with the Amiga. But I have an ST now, and it's a nicer one, and I just recently rebuilt the monitor. I wanted to show it to you because, you know, rebuilding some of these old CRT monitors, you get to translate some of these arcade skills over. So I thought you might get a kick out of seeing a pretty rare version of the ST, along with a pretty rare sound module for it. So let's take a look real quick. Now this is an STE, which is the enhanced version of the ST that came out after, I think, 1990-ish. We never got this version, I think, officially in the US, at least not in any kind of great quantity. The enhanced version was designed to kind of be more competitive with the Amiga, which had a much better graphics usage. But it's a pretty cool machine, and I imported this from the UK and then changed it to run on 120 volts. It's a lot cheaper to get them that way, actually, from the UK than over here, where they're a little rarer to find, so you can save yourself some money if you're patient and handy. Now, the problem I had was with the monitor. The monitor is what they call an SC1224, which is the color monitor that came out for the ST, which is proprietary, and there are many different versions of this monitor, and not a lot of information on the one I had, and I got some conflicting reports from some forums about who actually made this monitor. So I was getting a lot of bad banding and weird color saturation, and I had to order all the capacitors, and there are 32 capacitors on this stupid little 12-inch monitor. I had to order them all from Mouser, slowly put them together, and this thing, it's all little boards and the wires, they're really jammed in this little box. And eventually, once I got it recapped, it's better, but not great. I was really hoping for more vivibility. I maybe need to go in here and start looking at the diodes. The flyback, unfortunately, is no longer available, but it'll work for now. But the great thing is, it's essentially like repairing any kind of arcade game monitor. One of the cool things I have for my ST is this Roland MT32 sound module, which was a very expensive piece of equipment back in the 80s when it came out. I think it cost over $1,000, this thing, or pretty close to it. And this allowed a much better quality of sound, because the sound chip on the ST is okay, but it's not great. But this was kind of the era of better sound equipment, and especially for the ST, which has a MIDI output directly into the computer, which is the reason musicians like it so much. And here we have the graphical interface. It was icon-driven system with the ST, which was pretty early. I think it's just as good as the Mac system that was out during the time. It's okay. It's not going to set the world on fire. But I wanted to show you kind of what this sounded like. So I'm going to play one of my favorite games here, which is Space Quest 3. And you'll hear it. Just the sound is really amazing. So there you go. Pretty impressive for 80s technology. The sound and the graphics are pretty good on this computer. The Amiga was obviously the big competitor for the ST in Europe. And the Amiga had probably a little bit better of a cult following with some folks here in America as well. But a neat computer. I've always loved STs. I loved my ST growing up. It was one of my favorite computers I ever had. And I'm tickled to have this now, and I have a device to make it read USBs that I haven't installed yet that will, I guess, make it run almost any program I can download into a USB. So maybe in a future program I'll show that off once I get that installed. And like I said, I don't do a lot of this kind of nostalgic outside of arcade stuff, but the Atari ST is an interesting computer just because of the history of Atari and what Atari became after 1985 with the Tramiels in charge. And there's all sorts of information, books and videos online. You can read all about that if you so desire. I'm not going to bore you with it here. I just thought you might like to see it. So there you go. There's my STE computer, which is, the monitor actually looks pretty good now, thanks to the cap kit and the rebuilding. Maybe one day I'll get a better flyback for it. We'll see. So we're upstairs here in the arcade, and for those of you who have watched any of my previous videos, I did a series on the history of Centuri. In a nutshell, Centuri was at one time one of the largest manufacturers of arcade games in the USA, and they unfortunately no longer exist. However, during their run, they made some pretty interesting games, although almost all their games, with the exception of one or two, were licensed by or from other companies, and actually developed very many of their own games. Their most fruitful partnership was with Konami. And in 1982, they came out with a series of games that were not very well revered, and none of them were very successful. And most of the games they came out with in the year 1982 were very, very limited production runs. And one of those games is this game, which is Loco-Motion. So let's take a look at it real quick. Okay, so here's Loco-Motion in our Mikey cabinet. And Loco-Motion is interesting because it's basically like one of those old slider puzzles with the numbers you may have played in the back of a minivan or a station wagon when you were a kid. And it's an odd choice of a concept for an arcade game. You didn't really see a lot of these kind of puzzle games in arcade cabinets in the early 80s when it was mostly populated by games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders and Asteroids. But this game would probably be at home on a tablet or a phone today, and you may have played a very similar game to this on a home computer at some point in your life. It reminds me a lot of the 90s game called Pipe Dream. So let's play it real quick and I'll just kind of show it to you. It's a pretty neat game, even though it's kind of primitive, even for 1982. And you only really have two controls. You have the ability to slide the paths that move the train, and then the button will make the train go faster. And what you're trying to do is pick up your little happy face passengers and not make the train go off the track or go to a dead end. Now when the timer runs out of the station, the people basically get sick of waiting for you, and they either give up, or sometimes a little monster train or a crazy train will come out. And, see, here comes the crazy train, which to me looks like a cat with two heads and wheels. But let's see if we can get over here. That kind of worked out. Locomotion was, again, not obviously a huge success. They didn't make very many of them, although there was an official version of it available for the Intellivision. And a very similar game also came out for the Intellivision from Activision called Happy Trails. And some other translations of the game came out for like the Tomy Tudor computer, which we didn't really get here in the US in great quantities, and some other systems. And the Locomotion name has been used for a lot of other train video games. Some of them similar to this, but not necessarily related. And even a pinball machine in Italy was named Locomotion. Now, the other side note that's interesting about this game is there was a very similar game in production at Atari called Quack, which used baby ducks getting across a riverbank, and it actually used a touchscreen, and it was in development in 1982, but it never came out, either because of the expense of the touchscreen in 1982, or it might have been because Atari saw that Locomotion was kind of a flop and no one really bought it, so they decided to pull back from development of Quack. But this is a really cool game. It gets obviously harder as it goes along, the puzzle gets more complex, and there's a couple other enemies that pop up. It's pretty rudimentary, it's pretty simple, but it's a nice basic game from Konami, and it has some pretty decent music and an attempt at some pseudo 3D cutscenes in between. But I'm real happy to have it in my collection. There are very few people who have the dedicated uprights to this game anymore. I talked to a couple collectors who have them, and they're pretty, I guess, stoked to have them in their collection. Just not a game you hear about very much, despite its rather rare state, and not a game you're probably going to hear a lot about in general in arcade circles. So there you go. There is Locomotion, a very rare PCB, in our Mikey cabinet, which is another rare PCB, and it joins kind of this cabinet of weirdo games that are in the Mikey right now. So there you go. That's the Quarantine Chronicles for this week. Hopefully next week I'll have some of the side art I've been waiting for, and we'll get some of the major projects done. Maybe we'll get some more cut stuff or fixed cabinet stuff with the Simpsons, and we'll see what happens. But thanks for watching the show. Hope you're doing well, and stay safe.